This is Clearly Christian with Dr. Cy Smith, bringing light and giving voice to our country's single greatest hope while moving the culture to God's design. Our mission, to increase the census of those who live and influence society from a biblical worldview. The time for Clearly Christian is now. Here is your host, Dr. Cy Smith.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cy Smith, and this is Clearly Christian, a podcast about what it means to see the world from a biblical worldview, or biblical frame of reference, or even God's perspective, and then the impact that that has on training the next generation to live a life consistent with that biblical worldview. Today, I'm excited to welcome our guest, Pastor Phil Leineweber. He's an associate pastor at Berean Baptist Church in Mansfield, Ohio, and he's also the vice president of the school board at Mansfield Christian School. And in short time, Pastor Leineweber has emerged as a well-respected speaker and thinker on the topic of biblical worldview, specifically as it relates to youth. And as you may recall, generations Y and Z, as I've identified them previously on this podcast. So we'll get to him just momentarily. And again, I'm excited to welcome him. But first, let's go to school and let's set this up in terms of what we're going to be talking about today. Today, I want you to know more about what it means to hold a biblical worldview and why that matters for us moving forward. You know, everyone has a worldview, whether they realize it or not. In other words, they understand a story of the world, what has been, what is right now, and the way things may be in the future. And if you're a Christian, like I am, and perhaps many of you in the audience, you recognize that this story of the world is God's story, and that's what you know to be true. You don't just believe it, you know it to be true. And we like to say that God's story has 4 chapters. Chapter 1, creation, and then the fall, and then redemption, and then restoration. I've heard them explain like this. Chapter 1, creation, the way things ought to be. The way God designed them originally, they were perfect without sin. Then chapter 2, the fall, the sin entered the world and then marred everything. And we know inherently as believers now born into this world, something's just not right. That's why good things happen to, or bad things happen to good people, as they say. So the fall certainly changed everything. That's the way things are. And then redemption, the way things can be. Thanks to Christ redeeming us and his work on the cross and forgiveness of sin, now we've been restored or reconciled with him. And we can restore that relationship with not only him vertically, but then with each other horizontally. So the way things can be, and that's a wonderful time that we're living in now of redemption in chapter 3. And then chapter 4, restoration, the way things will be in the future when Christ returns and sets up a new heaven and a new earth. So for the Christian, that's really what they understand to be, again, God's story, this narrative of the world, and really that's biblical worldview. And this frames all the context for how we see the world, everything that has happened, everything that happens now, and what might happen in the future. All of life is interpreted through that lens. So let me make 3 chalkboard points moving forward, and then we'll jump right into Pastor Leineweber in light of what I said here already. Point number 1, worldview matters. Worldview matters, period. As we mature, our biblical worldview is on display in how we think and how we act. It impacts everything that we do in life, from whom we marry, where we live, how we think about politics and entertainment and the media, what you choose to do for a living, what you choose, again, for your own entertainment and your leisure time and things like that. It really impacts, of course, how you live your life from start to finish, how you raise your children. And whether you realize it or not, everyone has a worldview. Point number 2, chalkboard point number 2. To be in school is to acquire a worldview. You can't be educated without picking up and acquiring a worldview. Everything we do in schools, from preschool to graduate school, is impacted by or driven by some basic assumptions about how things are and how things can be. It just can't be avoided. There's a narrative for every subject that we teach in school, and make no mistake, kids pick it up. As it says in Luke 6, a student who is fully trained will be like his teacher. So there's a narrative, again, for everything we teach in school. And chalkboard point number 3, secularism is a worldview, and we tend not to think of it like that, or maybe we don't say those terms, but secularism is a worldview. In other words, it's a worldview without God. And most of the children in this school, around 90%, or in this country, about 90% are educated in this particular worldview, where they learn 3 basic things consistent with all of this in a secularist worldview. Number 1, that there is no God, or at least he's irrelevant here. No supernatural God. Number 2, the physical matter, the physical universe, the physical cosmos is all that exists. And it has sprung up somewhere uniquely, perhaps chaotically. It's unguided, but that's really all we can know is the physical. And number 3, the supernatural or religious experiences really are a personal and a private matter. And that's the secularist worldview that is, again, at play in our schools around the country, that 90% of our population has been educated under that particular influence. So again, worldview matters. To be in school is to acquire a worldview, and secularism is a worldview. There's a grand story, or there's a grand narrative about the world. Christians have a specific worldview based on what we know is true. It's God's story, creation, fall, redemption, restoration. The secularists have a worldview as well. There is no God, or he's not relevant here. The physical cosmos is all that exists, and all religious experiences are personal or private matter. Well, now you know more. And as I've said before, about biblical worldview, when you know more, now you can do more. You can think differently, and perhaps you can act differently, and you can say no more if you must, and you can act on those convictions and change direction. So that sets us up well, I think, for what we're talking about now. And so let's jump into our lesson, and let's put this into practice, and let's officially, again, welcome our guest with us today, Pastor Phil Leineweber. So Phil, great to have you here. Again, as I said, he's the associate pastor at Berean Baptist Church here in Mansfield, married to Sarah, and I know they have 3 active boys, as he put on his biography, and we appreciate those boys at Mansfield Christian School. He's got a Bachelor in Arts degree in religion from Liberty University, as well as his Master's in Biblical Studies, Master's of Divinity in Theological Studies from Liberty's Divinity School. He's currently completing his Doctor of Ministry degree from Southwest Baptist Theological Seminary, specializing in applied theology. I'm excited for Phil to finish that, and I know that'll just continue to open great doors for him. So, Pastor Leineweber, great to have you with us today.
Hey, Dr. Smith, thank you for having me. It's an honor and a privilege.
Oh, awesome. Great. Well, I know when I say worldview matters, you understand that fully. And worldview matters, period. How is it then that you tend to see this play out in your world, obviously in connection with both church and perhaps even school, but you see this obviously every day on an ongoing basis. How's this play out for you?
Yeah, well, it's something I'm passionate about, having worked with especially teenagers for over a decade, since I was a young man, just seeing how important it is, how every young follower of Christ sees the world. And we are living in a colossal shift of worldview in our culture. And I know you know this as well as anyone, but we are really living in a state where the truth is up for grabs. Where, individualism is on the rise. What I want to be true is what can be true for me. And we're seeing that play out in gender and identity and sexuality. This idea of pluralism, where we should just all be able to tolerate one another's beliefs unless you think mine aren't tolerable, then you are out. Then you are out. So there's no room for exclusivism. You need to be accepting of anyone and everyone. And so I really think worldview develops in the midst of a culture. Whether we know it or not, we're being affected by our cultural moment. That you can't shelter the next generation from our culture with media. I mean, you could do your best, but it's like you could live in a cave. But with media, our culture is brought into our homes and into the palm of almost every student that I see in our church or in our community. And so they're being indoctrinated with a worldview by our culture. And I would agree, it's a secular worldview. And so we are already, as Christian leaders and parents and Christians ourselves, we need to be we're already on the defensive by nature of the water that we're swimming in. And so I know David Kinnaman from Barna has called this culture, this world, the digital Babylon. And, it's where we used to be able to monitor who our kids' friends are. Now those friends are coming into their bedrooms via this device and into their minds and their thoughts via text messages and social media and entertainment and streaming. And so we form worldview in community and the villages that we're a part of. The scary thing is our village has become global overnight. And even for a 13-year-old with an iPhone, his community that is forming his worldview could involve people on the other side of the planet, bringing who knows what kind of ideas that are toxic to a Christian or biblical worldview. And so the truth is up for grabs. And, the community that is affecting the next generation is huge. I would say, as a word of encouragement, though, there's no, as I look at the next generation, there's not really ground to be in the middle in this. You're either going to sell out and be indoctrinated in the world's culture and ideals, or you're going to stand for truth like never before. And so as I look at young people who are passionate and are being educated and discipled into a Christian worldview, I'm seeing a missional generation stand up, excited to leverage media and social media and technology for the kingdom. I see this young generation that says, hey, we're going to finish the Great Commission. And we have the potential to do that like none before. And so, with this great need, this great threat, there's also a generation that's rising to that challenge. I just think how, there's a distrust across the board in this cultural moment of institutions and authority, and really it's the self that determines this truth. And so it doesn't matter what your heritage was, you will challenge the status quo. And so I just think of one story in particular of a student of mine who was seeking to represent a biblical worldview in their local school. And they told me about how they're at a lunch table, and because of their traditional position on marriage as an evangelical Christian, they were being just blasted by their peers. The ringleader was a cultural Catholic who would espouse, their church believes in traditional marriage. That doesn't matter. How dare you be so small-minded that you would accept a traditional biblical understanding of marriage? You should feel horrible about yourself. You're offending everyone here. And, this is a very gracious student. When I think about them, it's not like they're one that's going to pull out the boxing gloves. They're a kind-hearted student. And yet here it is, even you think a cultural Catholic who is leading the charge against them. No longer is the church an authority for worldview in the lives of young people.
Yeah, great. That's a lot there. Great answer. And a lot of things I'd love to pick up on and comment on, and I'll try to do my best here. And so just appreciate that. And maybe just specifically, I'll get right to that point that you made first off about the culture driving their worldviews. I think that's a significant thing because previously, obviously, as we were talking about in this intro, this being God's story and that driving our worldview. And so I interpret the culture via God's story. So that was in play long before the culture. And so what happens to me now and what will happen and how I respond in the future, I'll interpret that because this is God's story. And it was here long before I was. Now, what you're saying is it's flipped. And so what I'm receiving from the culture now, I'll take in, and that will become the new driver of how I think. And it could change, right? It could be fluid on a relatively regular basis, because whatever might have the greatest impact or the greatest influence on my thinking at this point in my life now determines my worldview. So it was an interesting comment there. Well, specifically then, I guess that's a good segue. Specifically, what kinds of things are you seeing, or what things are you hearing from this generation now that really you think, yep, this really kind of defines their worldview in many ways as a result of the culture? Maybe some specific examples there.
Yeah, well, I think you hit on a reality is it's changing faster than ever has before. With this technology and the information age, I'm a millennial, I'm in my mid 30s, but I can see the generation Gen Y you referred to, or Gen Z behind me, they've already moved on. It's quick. It's that fast. Right. And not just a subtle shift like you might see from boomers to Gen X. It's a complete revolution already within the next generation. So even as someone who works with the next, I feel like I'm an old guy. I'm an old man. I'm already out of touch. And so, I feel like for millennials, Gen Y, there was this idea of, moralistic therapeutic deism. Christian Smith alludes to that idea. And so religion, the purpose of, faith is really about being a better person, about being happy, finding purpose. And God's not really that involved in your day-to-day life. That's the deism. He's there maybe if you need him in an emergency, but for the most part, we're just kind of coasting, it's a little bit of individualism, and it's just God, add some God, sprinkle some God into my life, and it'll be better. But with Gen Z, it is much less of let's just tolerate almost a passive Christianity light. It's either a complete rejection or a complete embracing. It seems like with media, with just so many alternatives out there, there's not much room for middle ground anymore, and it can turn on a dime. And so, a postmodern pluralism where there is no truth. Like I said earlier, the truth is up for grabs. An older generation might say, "Live and let live." That seems to be the motto. And if you don't let others live their truth, you're the worst enemy. You're the oppressor. You're the one who is stifling my purpose. My greatest good is to express myself authentically. And when I don't do that, when I'm not able to do that, when you're hindering that or making me feel bad for doing that, you are the enemy of my happiness. And so, expressing oneself individually, the selfie generation, it's like that is the greatest good, living an authentic life. I just feel like that has become the greatest good, is being true to yourself. And we'll get into this probably in a second, but it is causing mayhem in the hearts and the lives of young people because that is a shifting sand to build a house upon.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Yeah. Well said. And you're exactly right. What we're seeing here in schools, especially, is, maybe if there is some sort of upside, it's that, we have lost a lot of that middle ground. Because if you're going to say you're a believer now, well, then this is the way you should walk and talk and live and follow those things very authentically. You don't kind of flirt in that middle gray, perhaps, as you did a generation or so ago. Because then if you want to go completely a different direction, well, then you better go all in that direction. But like you said, what has changed is on the downside is, well, then I need to have that respect, that position not only respected, but celebrated as my truth. And so, you can have your Christian truth and you can camp out over there, but I have my equal valid truth and I have a right to pursue an authentic belief over here as well. However misguided you may seem, that's irrelevant. Those things are separated. You have yours, I have mine, and we can't encroach upon those things.
Yeah. And it's just this idea that we can both have conflicting truths is just, I know for older generations especially, is so frustrating. Yeah. It's like that, but it seems like the younger generations, and I feel like I have a foot in that, I hope, that paradox is not as difficult, because what really matters is my feelings, not the truth.
Yeah.
What really matters is the subjective experience, not the objective reality. Yeah. And so I can surrender objective truth if it means subjective comfort. And that's a scary thing. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there, because there's still an emphasis on knowledge and information and almost that modernism, like we can save the world via technology and innovation, but all of those things, though innovation that has driven this really prosperity in the world, it is based upon true realities in science and in mathematics and physics. And to act like morality, to act like metaphysics has its own set of rules is really inconsistent. And like you even alluded to, this idea of a grand story, worldview matters. I mean, you don't have to look more than, the chaos that we see in our culture. We have to look a week ago, or 2 weeks ago that there's a shooting. And I don't see, with social media, you see virtue signaling more than I've ever seen it before,
right?
Especially by Gen Z, whether it be on the environment or justice issues. Where do they get that passion and that zeal for these virtues?
Yeah.
And that's where I think there's a lot of inroads where their worldview, their subjective worldview, gives them no authority to speak in the way that they do. And that's where a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, gets to jump right in and say, we can tell you why justice really matters. Mm-hmm. We can tell you why, racial unity actually is a God-given idea. We're all made in the image of God. Yeah. We can tell you why, your sexuality does matter and God doesn't make mistakes. And you are, designed and made with great intentionality, and your worth comes from the fact that you have a maker. And so I really believe, as you even said, the biblical worldview gives us a better story, a more compelling story in a world of, I think, a lack of certainty.
Yeah. Well said. Yep. Appreciate that. A lot there to unpack as well. And you just said it very well. And you mentioned earlier, even as you started, you're part of that, millennial generation, that Gen Y. And so I'm sure you've wrestled with some of these things in your peers and continue to do so. And it's changed so fast, as you mentioned. So a great comment. And so I wanted to ask, even in your own life and your ministry, in the short, 15, 20 years perhaps that you've been doing this. What are some significant changes, some benchmark times or concepts that you've seen? Boy, for me, we were really camped out on this issue, but now just 10, 15 years later, these are some of the things that now really have to be a focus of my life in the church world with youth today. Yeah.
Well, my first year in college, which was, I'll make you feel really old, 2005, Facebook had just launched. And so social media was an idea. It wasn't practical. And when it launched at that time, it was you had to have an EDU email address to get on it. It was kind of an exclusive club for college students, which is why it exploded, because you felt like you were part of a special thing. Now social media is an assumption for a young person. I'm on social media. I'm using it. Not only that, I've got a smartphone that allows me to interact in all these environments. And so technology has completely exploded. When I started high school, very few of my peers had phones. By the time I was done college, everyone had a smartphone. And so just in a short amount of time, technology just exploded. The issue of gender identity was not a thing. It was maybe a very fringe idea. At that time, I think, gay marriage was more a mainstream idea in the culture war, but not gender theory. And so that has changed radically within the last 10 years. And so, again, a relatively short amount of time for a significant cultural shift. Something I've seen recently in the last several years is, the parent generation that you're gearing towards at Mansfield Christian are now millennials. Millennials grew up with technology.
Right.
And so parenting has changed, and there's a greater awareness of the threat of media and technology by parents. That's been a good shift, where parents are concerned with their children's technology use and know the power of it for good and ill, and want to really help their children develop wisdom in how they use technology. So.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great points. And I would certainly echo that as well, as we're seeing that also here. And that's definitely a big shift since, as you said, since you were there. We were probably heading in that direction where parents were getting into the swing of the use of, hey, yeah, I've grown up with an iPhone as well, and I've grown up with technology also, and we'll do the best we can to maybe monitor how that goes in our house. There was always kind of the feeling, even, 5 to 10 years ago, is, hey, I think we can just manage it with a few filters. We would put on workshops. You could go to church and find a few companies that maybe I could just do this, and we'll probably be pretty safe. But overall, we kind of enjoy the benefits, and I think I can trust my children. And now, that ship has sailed, and parents are much more in tune to saying, boy, I have to be overzealous when it comes to technology with my children, and how that looks might be different from family to family, but they're becoming way more passionate as millennial parents about really safeguarding their children in many ways. Now, I'm not saying they all are not giving their children iPhones and not giving their children technology, but they are definitely using a greater amount of discretion than ever before, and certainly as they did even 10, 15 years ago, no doubt about it. Gender identity. Yeah, exactly what you said. How many pastors out there, how many school people, how many teachers, how many pastors were certainly not trained to deal with this specific issue. And they're dealing with it on the fly as best they possibly can. Never, even for millennials like yourself, who might be in their uppers, 30s, and 40s, never managed or never would have thought in their imagination that they were going to be dealing with this as a primary issue in their youth groups, where I'm going to have to talk through these things about what it means to be made in God's image and what kind of value that has for me. How do I take, a godly pride in being a male the way God made me? And what is that role as I live out this part of God's story? And what does it mean to be proud of being a female? And how uniquely different is that? And these seem to be just things we were going to take for granted. And now all of a sudden, millennial pastors everywhere, and boomers largely exiting, but still Gen X and then millennials as well saying in schools, wow, how do I even handle this on the school front? And thank goodness for Christian schools and educational experiences like us, where parents really say to us, we expect you to deal with that at school because that's a big, big issue. And we're trying to get a handle on it at home, but we really need you to walk beside us at school.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, we need to, as the church, in our homes and in Christian schools, we need to talk about these issues. And that's the issue with the digital Babylon, is because if we don't, someone else will, and our kids are being indoctrinated by media. And so, how do we help them develop that biblical worldview?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the church, and that's exactly where I was headed next. What do you think then is the role of the church? I mean, I kind of understand my role very specifically, and we try to act as an extension of the church here at Christian School. So we're very interested in this. But what do you think is the role of the church in this emerging generation of young adults today? In what ways are you trying to come alongside families and really meet them where they're at, knowing that, boy, no two families may be alike on some of these things?
Yeah, well, I think of a situation not long ago where an unchurched mom, showed up with her teenage daughter who had threatened to take her own life, and just said, "We need help," and I didn't know where else to go. Again, a parent who was not frequently in church, but just knew that what her daughter needed was something that no one else could offer that she knew of, and so she knew nothing else than to go to the church. And so I'm seeing just a massive mental health crisis in young people. And I really believe that's because when you base reality and meaning on yourself and your own self-expression, it's a house of cards. Yeah. And so, if my greatest purpose is my self-actualization, man, it's like it's torture to the soul, because anytime I experience dissatisfaction, I must be doing something wrong. Anytime I feel like I'm broken, there's no answer for that. And so I think we've taken legitimate purpose away from young people by removing a biblical worldview in our culture and in our schools and our lives. Things become a lot more simple when it's God made you. He made you in his image. You have intrinsic value and worth. You're not a mistake, and he loves you. And the greatest demonstration of that is he sent his son to die on the cross for you. And that's back to that redemption. That's a biblical worldview. And he wants to have a restored relationship with you through faith in his son, Jesus Christ. Yeah. And your purpose is tied to your relationship with your maker. The lines become a lot clearer. And so I think for the church to continue to be, as Paul said, a pillar and buttress of the truth, that we would proclaim the truth of God, that our purpose is found in him, that redemption and salvation is only found in Jesus Christ. One of my greatest concerns is for biblical illiteracy in our culture, even in our Christian churches. I think with technology, we've become as a culture intellectually lazy, and the church has not gone untouched by that. And so how do we have, in a culture that's continuously attacking a biblical worldview, even pastors who would claim to be Christian who have far from a biblical worldview, reinterpreting scriptures in ways they haven't been interpreted in millennia? We need people who know God's word, know how to rightly divide the word of truth, and will speak it boldly in a post-Christian culture.
Yeah, wow. I think biblical illiteracy could be a whole show in and of itself, and you really touched on something there. And we definitely would share that same concern, because we have to take that very seriously here, because we obviously at Christian schools, we use Bible teachers, as they're often called. And so these are, men and women who we've entrusted to share that biblical worldview every day, class after class after class. And so we now more than ever are trying to safeguard, yes, what are we teaching in those courses, and making sure that it really does line up, because even they can be impacted, just like these pastors that you're saying. They can be influenced by things that maybe aren't quite exactly aren't accurate. And maybe we're letting something creep in that shouldn't necessarily be there. So we have to have a strong sense of where we're going as a Christian school. So we totally get that. And we have a lot of built-in accountability measures like that in a large organization. But if I'm in a church of maybe 200 people and I've got 1 to 2 people on staff, and 90% of all those roles are done by the executive pastor, right? Where's the safeguard there to make sure that we are making that everything that's being preached from the pulpit is lining up with, again, God's truth? And so, we're seeing that as well.
That's good.
Yeah. Great. Well, as we kind of maybe draw our time to a close, but I wanted to look at even big picture here and maybe jump to some of the national trends that you're hearing about, or that you're reading about, or that you're even perceiving as you talk with your peers in the church world, and even those in the education world as well. Kind of the national trends that you're keeping your eye on with regard to this next generation. Where do you think we're kind of moving from here? What do you think's around the corner, and how can we best start getting prepared for that as both educators and church leaders?
Yeah, I really think, technology is not going away. And it's interesting, even with this advent recently of AI, I think Google taught us we don't need to remember anything. AI, I think, is going to teach us that we don't need to think anything. And so how do we encourage our young people that, man, God gave you a mind, and man, the greatest strategy the enemy could ever get is for young people, for old people alike, to stop thinking. God's word says we're transformed by the renewing of our mind. Yeah. And so people who know God's word and allow their minds to think deeply, I really believe God calls us as followers of Jesus to be the best thinkers on the planet. Yeah. And so how do we be transformed by the renewing of our minds, set our minds on things above, and be ready to give an answer for the hope that is in us in a culture that increasingly has no hope? Yeah. Great. Yep. Totally agree. And I was at a conference not too long ago, and AI definitely came up as one of those things you can imagine in education. We're all, I wouldn't say we're panicked, and I was appreciative of some of the Christian school colleagues that I spoke with at dinner one evening were already on it. I mean, they had AI committees formed, and they had already dabbled with it themselves, and they were already introduced to different apps that can detect when a child has used AI to try to create an essay. So it was where they're using
AI to prevent the use of AI. We're smarter than we realize. But yeah, certainly. And I like how you said that. We could definitely forfeit our ability to think, and Satan would love nothing more. And that's so critical. And we see that obviously every day in the school business as well. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are you experiencing even? And can we filter all of that through this biblical worldview? And that is truth, and that is reality, not through what the culture says is acceptable, or not through all this myriad of different positions, but what does God say about these things? And you have to know it. And that's why obviously what we do in education and combined with what you're doing at church is so important, because it starts at those young ages. I've got to know some of those verses, and maybe we need some throwback experiences to those days when we were memorizing verses so the kids can recall those things and they can say, yeah, I remember memorizing that as a child in elementary school, and I remember this is how the teacher explained that we should apply it, and this is how the Sunday school teacher used it, and this is how the youth pastor used it, and this is how my third period Bible teacher used it, and all of these godly men and women are speaking the same truth into this child's life, so that when they confront something that is clearly contradictory to God's word, they say, whoa, this is a gigantic red flag here. I recognize this as a false idea. I'm not going to be taken captive here by this empty philosophy, as Paul says, because I do recognize it, and some red flags have gone up. And I can only do that if, as you said, my mind has been transformed. So without that transformation, which we would certainly contend probably isn't going to happen in 1 or 2 hours a month. And I know churches are pleading with their people to be there more and more and more. And I know a number of churches that are just knocking it out of the park and doing a great job. Those of us in Christian education would say kudos to you and amen. Let us help you take it to the next level. And let us work with you as Christian schools to say, we do that for 7, 8, 9, 10 hours a day. 5 days a week when it comes to extracurriculars and club activities and the classes and things like that. And so we're going to come alongside those churches, good churches like Berean, and say, yep, it's going to take all of us. And then those other hours at home to make sure that we're building in that biblical worldview, because the culture, like you said, technology is not going to stop. It's strong. The culture is not going to stop. It is just going to keep pressing. You don't want the culture to be the default worldview for your child.
Yeah, that's good. Well said.
Yeah, thank you. Well, tell us in closing, if they want to know more about either Berean or Pastor Phil Leineweber, I know you do a blog. If they want to know a little bit more about you and what you say on these matters, how can they read more about what you're thinking? Or if there's anything else that you want to say in terms of a connection with you?
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, BereanFamily.com. We're in Central Ohio, Mansfield, Ohio, and we want to be a church that is enjoying God together, growing in grace and truth, and taking life in Christ to the heart of Ohio and beyond. And so that's why we exist. God has just really shown a lot of favor in this season in our church, and we're seeking to partner with great organizations like MCS to make disciples that will reach the nations and push back on this culture. And so I blog at philwithgrace.com, and you can go on there. I love to blog about current events, apologetics, and worldview. And so it's one of my interests, and one of the reasons I love being a part of the board at Mansfield Christian School, just to make sure we're a school that continues to teach our young people to think and live biblically, and that they'd impact their culture and their world for Jesus.
Yeah, well, great. Well, we think highly of you at Mansfield Christian, and every school should be so fortunate to get Phil Leineweber on their board and on their leadership team. So we are thrilled, and thank you so much, brother, for what it is that you do. And we just look forward to our continued connection with not only Berean, but your own personal ministry as well. And we wish you certainly all the best. And this is probably the first of several times that we'll have you on as a guest, if that's okay with you.
I love that. Thank you.
Awesome. That's great. Well, appreciate you so much. Well, I trust that now you know more about biblical worldview. So thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast of Clearly Christian, because again, when you know more, you can do more. You can think differently and you can act differently, and you can say no more when you must act on those convictions and change direction for you and your family. The only way to turn things around in our country and to get where we need to be is by making sure that we have an increase in the number of people who truly live and operate with a biblical worldview and see the world from God's perspective. And the best means, or the greatest hope that we have of achieving this vision, is to increase the number of children, the next generation, who have received a Christian education, either at home or in Christian schools. So again, that's the premise of this show, and we look forward to more episodes on Clearly Christian. So thank you again for watching or listening to the podcast today. I'm Dr. Cy Smith, and again, this has been the Clearly Christian podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Clearly Christian podcast with Dr. Cy Smith. Hear more episodes at clearlychristianeducation.com. If you'd like more information about Christian education in your neighborhood, or if you're interested in education opportunities at Mansfield Christian School, or if you agree with Dr. Smith and want to help him in his mission to influence and awaken Christian America, you can send Dr. Smith an email through the clearlychristianeducation.com website. Message him on the Clearly Christian LinkedIn or Facebook page, or call the Clearly Christian Connection line at 419-756-5651. This has been the Clearly Christian podcast with Dr. Cy Smith on clearlychristianeducation.com, brought to you in conjunction with Mansfield Christian School, a Berean Media production.